The dust of a Texan afternoon clung to Ilara's worn boots like a second skin. It was hot, a dry, suffocating heat that seemed to seep into her very bones. She stood before a wooden desk in a dimly lit office, the scent of old paper and stale tobacco thick in the air. The lawyer, a man named Silas, steepled his fingers, his eyes cold and assessing. "You understand the terms, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "This is a contract, a legal, binding document. You will be married to Mr. Caleb Tanner for 1 year. You will live on his ranch, perform the duties of a wife, and in return, you will receive $200 a month. At the end of the term, you will be paid a final sum of $2,000, and the marriage will be annulled." Ilara's throat was dry. $200 a month, $2,000 at the end. It was an obscene amount of money, more than she had seen in her entire life. Enough to pay off her late husband's debts. Enough to secure a future for herself, far from the prying eyes and whispers of her hometown. She thought of the pile of foreclosure notices on her mantelpiece, the threat of ruin hanging over her head like a dark cloud. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at the man across the desk, Caleb Tanner. He sat tall and rigid in his chair, a stark contrast to her own weary posture. His face was a mask of chiseled stone, eyes the color of a stormy sky. He hadn't said a word since she had entered the office, his silence a heavy presence in the room. He was a cowboy through and through, his calloused hands, the faint scent of leather and horse, the way he held himself with an unyielding strength. It was a strength born of a harsh life, a life she knew nothing about. "Mr. Tanner needs a wife for a year," Silas continued, his gaze shifting to Caleb, "to ensure he retains full custody of his daughter Maeve, as stipulated in his late wife's will. Her family, the Whitlocks, are persistent. They've been using his unmarried status as a point of contention in court. This marriage will satisfy the legal requirement." Caleb finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a jolt through Ilara. "It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You do your part, I'll do mine." His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in them she saw no warmth, no kindness, only a pragmatic, desperate need. Ilara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Just so we're clear," she said, finding her voice again. "I'm not a ranch hand. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, but I don't know anything about horses or cattle." Caleb gave a curt nod. "That's fine. You'll be taking care of the house. And Maeve." The mention of his daughter seemed to soften his expression for just a moment, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Silas slid the papers across the desk. "Sign here, Mrs. Vance, and here." Ilara's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The signature would be her final act as Mrs. Vance. From this moment on, she would be Ilara Tanner. The new identity felt heavy, foreign. She thought of her life before the debts, before the loneliness, before the desperate need for a way out. This contract was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild, a chance to start over. She signed her name with a flourish she didn't feel, the ink a dark, final mark on the page. Caleb signed after her, his signature a bold, confident scrawl. The deal was done. "We'll leave for the ranch in the morning," Caleb said, standing abruptly. "Be ready by sunrise." He didn't wait for a response, simply turned and walked out of the office, the spurs on his boots jingling with each step. Ilara stood, her legs feeling wobbly. She was married, to a stranger, a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of equipment, a necessary tool for his legal battle. The reality of it hit her then, a cold wave of fear washing over her. What had she done? She was trading one kind of prison for another. But as she walked out into the searing Texas sun, a sense of grim determination settled in her stomach. She had a purpose now. For 1 year, she would be Mrs. Ilara Tanner, and she would do her part. The money was her only escape, her only hope, and for that she would do whatever it took. Her mind replayed the day's events, the hushed, desperate conversation with Silas, the cold stare of her new husband, the heavy weight of the contract. She was leaving everything behind. Her tiny, familiar town, the modest house that was no longer hers, the memories of a life that felt 1,000 miles away. She was an orphan, no family to speak of, and with her husband's death, she was truly alone in the world. This new life, this arrangement, was a leap into the unknown. But the past was a cage, and the future, though uncertain, held the promise of freedom. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, desperate flame. It was all she had. The journey to the Tanner Ranch was a blur of sun-baked land, endless stretches of golden plains, and the vast, unforgiving sky. Ilara sat in the wagon next to Caleb, the silence between them as expansive as the landscape. He drove with a practiced ease, his focus absolute. He pointed out landmarks with a brief nod or a grunt, but offered no further conversation. The silence was unnerving, making her feel more like cargo than a person. As the sun began its descent, the silhouette of a ranch came into view. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main house, a low-slung, sturdy structure built to withstand the elements. The house was well maintained, but lacked any warmth or personal touches. It looked functional, not lived in. A small stooped man, the ranch hand, approached the wagon as they pulled up. "Evening, Caleb," the man said, his voice raspy. He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. "This is my wife, Ilara," Caleb stated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He didn't look at her, but his grip on the reins tightened. "Ilara, this is Jed. He helps me with the ranch." Jed gave a respectful nod. "Welcome, ma'am." Ilara offered a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you, Jed." Caleb didn't linger. He led her to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside, leaving her to follow. The interior of the house was as stark as the exterior. The furniture was heavy and practical, covered with sheets to protect them from the dust. There were no pictures on the walls, no flowers in a vase, no signs of a woman's touch. It was a man's world, a world of necessity, not comfort. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Caleb said, his voice flat. "My room is at the end of the hall. Maeve's room is next to mine." He paused, a momentary hesitation in his posture. She's asleep. She doesn't talk much, not since her mother passed." Ilara's heart ached for the little girl she hadn't met yet. She looked at Caleb, and for the first time she saw a crack in his armor. The grief was there, etched into the lines around his eyes, a deep-seated pain he tried to hide behind a wall of stoicism. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Caleb's expression hardened again. "There's no need to be. It was a long time ago." He turned away from her, and Ilara knew the conversation was over. He showed her the kitchen, the pantry, and the well. His instructions were brief to the point, and devoid of emotion. He was simply laying out the rules of this new world. After the tour, he left her to her own devices, returning outside to tend to the animals. Ilara went to her room. It was bare but clean, with a small bed, a chest of drawers, and a wash basin. She unpacked her meager belongings, a few dresses, a worn photograph of her late husband, and a small leather-bound book of poetry. She felt a profound sense of loneliness. She was in a stranger's house, a stranger's life, and she was utterly alone. That night, she heard a soft sound from down the hall. A whimper. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Should she go? It wasn't her place. Caleb had made that clear. But the sound was heartbreakingly fragile, the cry of a child in distress. Her instincts won out. She padded silently down the hall to the open doorway of a small room. A little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, lay tangled in her sheets, her face stained with tears. Maeve. She had curly brown hair and a doll clutched tightly in her arms. Her little body was shaking with silent sobs. Ilara's heart melted. She walked to the bed and sat on the edge, a gentle weight. She didn't say anything, just reached out and stroked the girl's forehead. Maeve's eyes, a mirror of her father's stormy grey, fluttered open. She stared at Ilara, a confused, wary look on her face. Ilara offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's all right, sweetie," she whispered. "It's just a bad dream." Maeve's gaze lingered on her, and then, with a surprising amount of trust, she released her grip on the doll and reached for Ilara's hand. The little hand was small and warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of the house. Ilara took it, holding it gently. She stayed there for a long time, just stroking the girl's hair until the silent tears stopped and the little girl's breathing became slow and even. She tucked Maeve in, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Before she left, she kissed the girl's forehead, a simple maternal gesture that felt so natural it was like breathing. As she made her way back to her room, she saw Caleb standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. He had been watching. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else, a hint of gratitude that he was not used to expressing. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and gruff. "She was having a nightmare," Ilara explained, her voice soft. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on her. She hasn't let anyone get close since her mother. Not since before. Before the... He trailed off, unable to say the words. "She needs a mother," Ilara finished for him. He looked away, the mask of stoicism back in place. "She needs a legal guardian, that's what you are." His words were a cold reminder of the arrangement, of the business deal, but Ilara couldn't forget the warmth of Maeve's hand in hers, the trust in her eyes. It wasn't just a business deal, not anymore. It was about a little girl who needed a hand to hold in the dark. The days on the Tanner ranch settled into a quiet, structured rhythm. Ilara woke before dawn, the kitchen already filled with the heavy scent of coffee brewing on the stove. She would prepare breakfast for Caleb and Jed, often in silence. Caleb would eat quickly, his attention already on the day's work. He would give her a curt nod before disappearing out the door, the jingling of his spurs fading into the morning air. Ilara would then turn her attention to the house. She scrubbed floors, aired out dusty rooms, and mended clothes with a skill born of years of practice. She found a quiet satisfaction in bringing warmth and order to the sterile house. She added a vase of wildflowers to the kitchen table, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dark wood. She hung a simple embroidered cloth over the back of a chair. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Her primary focus, however, was Maeve. The little girl remained a puzzle. She never spoke, communicating only through gestures and a rare, hesitant smile. Ilara made it her mission to break through the wall of silence. She would read to her from the few books she found, her voice a soft, soothing melody. She would play simple games using a deck of cards or bits of string. She would sit with Maeve for hours, just being present, a quiet, unwavering presence. One afternoon, Ilara was in the kitchen baking a pie. The scent of cinnamon and apples filled the air. She glanced over and saw Maeve standing in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that was unnerving. Ilara smiled gently. "Would you like to help, sweetie?" she asked, her voice soft. Maeve hesitated, her gaze darting from the mixing bowl to Ilara's face. Slowly, tentatively, she walked over. Ilara handed her a small spoon. Maeve's little fingers clutched it awkwardly, but she carefully began to stir the filling. A small smile, fleeting but genuine, touched her lips. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time Maeve had participated in anything. Ilara praised her, her voice filled with a genuine joy that was hard to contain. That evening, when Caleb came in for dinner, he paused in the doorway. He looked at the pie on the counter, the vase of wildflowers, and the faint scent of cinnamon that hung in the air. He then looked at Maeve, who was sitting at the table, a tiny smudge of flour on her nose. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. Ilara followed his gaze. "She helped me with the pie," she said, her chest swelling with pride. Caleb looked at his daughter, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed as if he might say something, but he simply took his seat at the table and began to eat, the moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. The next day, Ilara found a small box on the kitchen counter. Inside were a few packs of seeds for a flower garden. She looked at Caleb, who was standing by the door, ready to leave. "Jed said you asked for some," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with genuine surprise. He just gave a short nod and was gone. The seeds were a small, unspoken gesture, but to Ilara, it was a chink in the armor. He was noticing. He was acknowledging her. He wasn't just looking at her as a legal requirement anymore. He was seeing the changes she was making, seeing the connection she was forging with his daughter. Ilara and Maeve spent the rest of the day in the small patch of land near the house, preparing the soil and planting the seeds. Maeve didn't speak, but her concentration was absolute. Her small hands worked the dirt, and a sense of purpose filled her. Ilara taught her how to plant the seeds just so, how to water them, how to be patient. She talked about the flowers they would become, their vibrant colors, their sweet scents. "Flowers are a promise," Ilara said softly, her hands covered in soil. "A promise that something beautiful can grow even in the hardest of places." Maeve looked at her, and in her grey eyes Ilara saw a flicker of understanding. The silent house was slowly, day by day, becoming a home, and the seeds they had planted, both in the ground and in their hearts, were a testament to that. The fragile peace of the ranch was shattered by the arrival of a sleek black carriage. It was an anomaly in the dusty landscape, a polished symbol of wealth and power. From it emerged a formidable woman, dressed in a black gown, her face a mask of disapproval. This was Martha Whitlock, Maeve's maternal grandmother, and the chief architect of the lawsuit against Caleb. She was accompanied by her son, Arthur, a pale, nervous man who seemed to shrink in his mother's shadow. Ilara, who had been hanging laundry on the line, froze. The air instantly became charged with tension. Caleb emerged from the barn, his posture stiffening as he saw the unwelcome visitors. He walked to the porch, his hand resting on the holster of his revolver, a clear, unspoken threat. "Martha," he greeted, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "Caleb," she returned, her voice a sharp, cutting blade. "We were surprised to hear of your recent marriage. A rather quick decision, wasn't it?" Her eyes swept over Ilara, a look of pure disdain on her face. "And who is this?" Caleb stepped forward, a protective instinct he didn't even know he had flaring to life. "This is my wife, Ilara Tanner." Ilara met Martha's gaze, her chin held high. She knew she was being judged, but she refused to be intimidated. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitlock." Martha's lips curled into a sneer. "I doubt that. I've come to see my granddaughter, and to assess her living situation now that a stranger has been brought into her life." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Maeve is fine. She's inside." Martha ignored him, her attention fixed on Ilara. "What is your background, young woman? Where are you from?" Ilara felt the weight of her past, the debts, the desperation, the shame, but she stood her ground. "I am from a town a few hundred miles east. My husband passed away recently, and I was looking for a new start." Martha's eyes narrowed. "A widow with no family. How convenient. I'm sure your motives are pure as the driven snow." "They are," Ilara said, her voice steady. "I care for your granddaughter, and I will do everything I can to make her happy." Just then, Maeve appeared in the doorway, clutching her doll. She saw her grandmother and uncle, and her small face, which had been so full of a tentative joy with Ilara, turned into a mask of fear. She hid behind Ilara's skirt, her small body trembling. "Maeve, darling," Martha said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness. "Come here, let your grandmother give you a hug." Maeve didn't move. She clutched Ilara's skirt tighter, her knuckles turning white. "You see, Caleb," Martha said, her tone suddenly triumphant. "She's afraid of you. She's afraid of your new wife. This is a hostile environment for her. We should be her guardians, not you." "She's afraid of you," Caleb growled, stepping forward. "You're the ones who insist on dragging her into court, upsetting her. She was doing better before you showed up." Arthur, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Mother, maybe we should leave. She's clearly upset." Martha shot him a venomous look. "Silence, Arthur. This is about family." She looked at Ilara again, her gaze hard. "I will be back, young woman, and I will find out who you really are. I will find every skeleton in your closet, and I will expose this sham of a marriage for what it is." With that, she turned and stormed back to the carriage, her son scurrying behind her. The carriage rumbled away, leaving a cloud of dust and an even heavier silence. Ilara looked down at Maeve, who was still trembling. She knelt and wrapped her arms around the girl, pulling her into a tight hug. "It's all right, sweetie. They're gone now. Everything is going to be all right. Maeve finally looked up, and for the first time Ilara saw not just fear but gratitude in her eyes. The girl leaned her head against Ilara's shoulder, a gesture of pure trust. Caleb stood a few feet away, his fists clenched. He watched the scene, his gaze fixed on Ilara. He saw the way she comforted his daughter, the way Maeve responded to her touch. He had always been so focused on providing, on protecting, on fighting the legal battles, that he hadn't considered what Maeve truly needed. And now he was seeing it with his own eyes. Ilara, the stranger he had hired, was providing a comfort he couldn't. "She's right," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper. Ilara looked at him, her heart aching for the burden he carried. "What are you talking about?" "This is a sham," he said, his eyes filled with a weary honesty. "It is a business deal. I can't give her what she needs. Not really." "Maybe you can," Ilara said, her voice firm. "Maybe you just haven't tried." She stood up, holding Maeve's hand. "This isn't a business deal for her, Caleb. She needs a family, and we're all she has." Caleb said nothing. He simply turned and walked back to the barn, the weight of his responsibilities a physical burden on his shoulders. But as he went, Ilara saw him glance back at them, a flicker of uncertainty in his stormy eyes. The Whitlocks' visit had done one thing. It had made the pretense of their marriage feel far too real. And the true battle, Ilara knew, was just beginning. The tension left behind by the Whitlocks hung in the air for days, a lingering shadow over the ranch. Caleb was even more withdrawn than usual, and Maeve clung to Ilara with a newfound desperation, as if afraid she would vanish. Ilara made it her mission to bring a sense of normalcy and joy back to the little girl's life. One afternoon, the sun beat down with relentless intensity. Ilara decided to take Maeve to the small creek that ran through the property. The water was cool and clear, a welcome respite from the heat. Ilara took off her shoes and dipped her feet in the water, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. Maeve sat on the bank watching her, her expression unreadable. "Come on, sweetie," Ilara coaxed. "The water feels so good." Maeve hesitated, but then, with a small, brave smile, she took off her shoes and socks and slowly waded into the shallow water. She let out a soft gasp as the cool water touched her feet. Ilara picked up a small rock and skipped it across the surface. Maeve watched, her eyes wide with fascination. "You try," Ilara said, handing her a flat stone. Maeve tried, but the rock sank immediately. She looked at Ilara, a look of frustration on her face. Ilara knelt beside her and gently showed her how to hold the stone, how to throw it, with just the right flick of the wrist. On her second try, the rock skipped once, twice, 3 times. A sound escaped Maeve's lips, a soft giggle. It was the first time Ilara had heard her laugh. It was a beautiful, fragile sound, like the tinkle of a tiny bell. Ilara's heart soared. She looked at Maeve, who was now beaming, her small face radiating pure joy. "You did it!" Ilara said, her voice filled with a genuine delight. Maeve giggled again, and then for the first time she spoke. It wasn't a word, it was a sound. A simple melodic "ah." A sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. Ilara felt a tear roll down her cheek. It was a breakthrough. The wall was finally cracking. They spent the rest of the afternoon playing in the water, their laughter echoing through the trees. When they returned to the ranch, their clothes were damp, their faces were flushed, and they were both glowing with a sense of accomplishment. Caleb was waiting for them on the porch. He watched them approach, his face a mix of emotions Ilara couldn't decipher. He saw the genuine smiles on their faces, the way Maeve's hand was clasped tightly in Ilara's. "You're late," he said, his voice gruff. But there was no anger in his tone, only a quiet awe. "We were at the creek," Ilara explained. "Maeve, she skipped a rock." Caleb's gaze shifted to his daughter. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "You did?" Maeve nodded, her smile still wide. She held up her wet, wrinkled hand as if to prove it. Caleb reached out and gently took her hand in his. He looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. "She laughed, Caleb," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard her laugh." A flicker of something passed over Caleb's face. It was a mixture of pain, of gratitude, and of a raw, unadulterated hope. He gently squeezed Maeve's hand, a wordless gesture of pride. That's good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood up, his tall frame a protective presence. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time he saw not just the woman he had hired, but the woman who was bringing light back into his daughter's life. He didn't know how to express the gratitude he felt. He wasn't a man of words. But in the way his eyes lingered on her, in the softening of his stance, Ilara saw it. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. The ice between them was slowly, finally, beginning to melt. That night, Ilara heard a sound from the living room. She crept down the stairs and found Caleb sitting in the dark, a small photograph in his hands. It was a picture of his late wife and Maeve, laughing. He wasn't crying, but the sorrow on his face was palpable. He looked up and saw Ilara standing there. He didn't say anything, just gestured to the empty seat beside him. Ilara sat, the silence between them no longer heavy but comfortable. She didn't ask about his wife. She didn't have to. She knew what it was like to lose someone you loved. She simply sat with him in the dark, a quiet, reassuring presence. And in the space between the two of them, a new kind of connection began to form. A connection built not on a contract, but on shared grief, on unspoken understanding, and on the glimmer of a little girl's laughter. A week passed in quiet harmony. The laughter Ilara and Maeve had discovered at the creek had become a more frequent presence in the house. Maeve would follow Ilara everywhere, a tiny, silent shadow, and Ilara would talk to her constantly, telling her stories, explaining what she was doing. Maeve's small, brave smiles were her reward. One morning, Ilara found Caleb in the barn, mending a saddle. She walked in, the scent of hay and leather filling her senses. She had a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Caleb," she began, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from his work, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "Go ahead." "About your wife, Maeve's mother. What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Caleb stiffened, his jaw tightening. He hesitated for a long moment, as if deciding whether to share this part of himself with her. Finally he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Her name was Sarah. She was beautiful, full of life. She loved this ranch more than anything. We were happy." His voice was a low, pained whisper. "She was with child, our second. There were complications. The doctor, he couldn't save her, or the baby." Ilara's heart broke for him. The pain was still so raw, so close to the surface. "I'm so sorry, Caleb." "Maeve, she was with her when it happened," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "She was just a little thing, but she saw it all. The pain, the blood, the emptiness after. She hasn't spoken a word since." He looked at Ilara, a world of pain and guilt in his eyes. "I couldn't protect her, I wasn't there." Ilara's voice was soft, empathetic. "You can't blame yourself for that, Caleb. You did everything you could." He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "I don't know what to do. The court, the Whitlocks. They say I'm not fit to raise her, that I'm too broken." "You're not broken," Ilara said, her voice firm. "You're grieving. There's a difference. And you're not alone in this. We're in this together." Caleb's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "We're not. This is a job for you, a contract." "Maybe it started that way," Ilara said, her gaze steady. "But it's not anymore. Maeve is not a part of a business deal. She's a little girl who needs us. Both of us." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, earnest tone. "The Whitlocks will be back, Caleb. They'll try to find a reason to take her. They'll scrutinize our marriage, our lives. We have to be a family, a real one, at least on the surface. We have to make them believe we are in this together." Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not a mercenary, but a compassionate woman who had found a place in his silent, grief-stricken world. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the strength in her posture. He saw the way she had connected with his daughter, in a way he never could. "What do you propose?" he asked, his voice low. "We make a pact," Elara said. "We stop being landlord and tenant. We become partners. We talk, we share. We have dinner together at the table. We act like a real family, not just for them but for Maeve. She needs to see us as a team." He considered her words for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. He found none. He saw only a woman who was offering to stand by him, to help him carry a burden that had become too heavy for one man to bear. Slowly, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. "Partners," he repeated, the word sounding foreign yet right on his tongue. "Partners," Elara affirmed. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity. The contact was brief, but a spark passed between them. It wasn't the heat of a burgeoning romance, but the warmth of a nascent trust. From that moment on, something shifted. Caleb began to eat dinner at the table with Elara and Maeve. He would ask Elara about her day, about the house. He would watch Maeve with a newfound attention, his face softening when she made a small gesture or a tiny sound. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a quiet understanding. Elara felt the weight of her desperation slowly lifting. She was no longer just working for money. She was building something, a home, a family. She was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was a woman building a future that was no longer just about survival, but about a purpose far greater than herself. The weekly trip to town was a necessary chore, a link to the outside world. Caleb would go to pick up supplies, and Elara would stay behind, guarding the fragile peace they had built. But this week, Caleb asked her to come with him. "You need to get out of the house," he said simply, his voice matter-of-fact. "And it would look more convincing if we go together. For the Whitlocks." Elara agreed, a small thrill of anticipation running through her. It would be her first time in the town of Harmony, a small, bustling settlement that served as the hub for the surrounding ranches. She dressed in her best, a simple cotton dress, and tied her hair with a ribbon. She looked more like a wife now, less like a desperate woman. The town was a vibrant cacophony of sounds and smells. The clatter of hooves on dirt roads, the chatter of vendors, the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee. Elara took it all in, her eyes wide with a quiet delight. It was a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the ranch. As they walked down the main street, Elara noticed the looks they were getting. Whispers followed them and people stared with open curiosity. The story of Caleb's new wife had clearly made its way through the town. Caleb seemed oblivious to the stares, his focus on the task at hand. But Elara felt the weight of their scrutiny. Suddenly, a woman called out from a shop doorway. "Elara? Elara Vance?" Elara froze. The voice was familiar, a ghost from her past. She turned and saw Sarah Miller, a woman she had known in her old town, a friend of her late husband. Sarah's face was a mixture of surprise and concern. Caleb looked at Elara, his brow furrowed. "You know her?" Elara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was an acquaintance. Sarah walked towards them, her eyes full of questions. "What are you doing here, Elara? And who is this man?" Her gaze shifted to Caleb, a look of suspicion creeping into her eyes. "This is my husband, Caleb Tanner," Elara said, her voice strained but firm. We live on a ranch outside of town." Sarah's eyes widened. "Husband? But I thought you were—" "I'm so sorry, Elara. We were all so worried about you after—" She trailed off, her gaze shifting to Caleb. The subtext was clear. "After you ran away from your problems." Caleb's expression hardened. He sensed the unspoken judgment, the history he was not a part of. He placed a hand on the small of Elara's back, a simple, protective gesture that felt immensely reassuring. "We have to go," he said to Elara, his voice a low command. "We have things to do." He led her away, his presence a shield against the prying eyes of Sarah Miller. But Elara knew the damage was done. Sarah had seen them. She would talk. And the story of her past, the debts, the desperate situation she had fled, would eventually make its way to the ears of the Whitlocks. As they continued their shopping, Ilara felt a sense of dread. The past was not just a memory, it was a living, breathing thing that could come back to haunt her. She was not as free as she thought she was. Back in the wagon on the long, dusty road back to the ranch, Caleb was silent. Ilara finally broke the stillness. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with a quiet shame. "I didn't think I would run into anyone I knew." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "What was she talking about? The things you ran away from?" Ilara sighed, her shoulders slumping. "My late husband. He left me with a lot of debt. I was on the verge of losing everything. The house, the land, everything." She looked at him, her gaze honest and unwavering. "I took this deal because I had no other choice. It was a chance to start over, to pay off the past." Caleb was silent for a long moment. He didn't say anything, didn't pass judgment. He simply nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. He knew what it was like to be a prisoner of the past. He was still a prisoner of his own grief. "Your secret is safe with me, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't care about your past. I care about the woman who is bringing my daughter back to life." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit. The shame and fear she had felt began to dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. She looked at him, at the strong, stoic man who was slowly revealing the man he was inside. She had come to the ranch for money, but she had found something more. She had found a partner, a man who was not just a means to an end, but a person who understood, who didn't judge and who, in his own quiet way, was a source of strength. And for the first time, Ilara felt a profound connection to this man, a connection that had nothing to do with a contract and everything to do with a shared, fragile humanity. The day after their trip to town, Caleb was in the barn, his face a grim mask. He had received a letter from Silas, the lawyer. He read it, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tight. Ilara, who was coming to the barn to get some eggs, saw the tension in his posture. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He handed her the letter. It was from the Whitlock's lawyers. They were demanding a new court hearing, citing new information about Caleb's unconventional marriage and the suspicious circumstances surrounding it. The letter did not explicitly mention Ilara's past, but the implication was clear. They had found out. Sarah Miller had talked. "They're going to try to use your past against us," Caleb said, his voice flat. "They'll say I hired a woman with a questionable background, that our marriage is a sham, a last-ditch effort to keep Maeve." Ilara's heart sank. Her past was a liability, just as she had feared. All the progress they had made, all the fragile bonds they had formed, felt like they were on the verge of collapsing. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she said, her voice a whisper. "I've ruined everything." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of anger and weariness. But the anger wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the situation, at the endless fight, at the people who refused to let him be. "No, you haven't," he said, his voice low and firm. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were just trying to survive, just like me. We'll face this together." He walked over to a workbench and pulled out a worn-out map of the property. He spread it out, his finger tracing the outlines of the ranch, the fences, the grazing fields. "The court hearing is in 2 weeks. They'll send someone to inspect the property, to interview us, to talk to Jed." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "We need to make this look as real as possible. We need to be a family, not just for them, but for us, for Maeve." He began to talk, outlining a plan. He would teach her about the ranch, about the horses and the cattle. She would learn the names of the fields, the schedule of the seasons. They would work together in the yard, in the house. They would present a united front, a fortress of a family. "They'll be looking for inconsistencies," he said, his gaze intense. "They'll ask you questions about my work, about my life. I need you to know the answers." Ilara listened, her fear slowly being replaced by a steely determination. She had faced worse things. She had survived. And she would not let this family, this little girl she had come to love, be taken away. "I'll do it," she said, her voice strong. "Teach me everything. I'll learn it all." And so, their partnership took on a new urgency. Caleb took her on tours of the ranch, explaining the intricacies of running a cattle business. He taught her how to recognize a sick horse, how to mend a fence, how to brand a calf. He was a patient teacher, his gruff exterior giving way to a quiet, focused expertise. Ilara was a quick study, soaking up every detail. They would stand on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Caleb would point out the constellations, telling her stories of the land, of his family. He opened up to her in a way he had never opened up to anyone, and Ilara, in turn, told him about her life before the debts, before the grief. She told him about her hopes, her dreams. Their bond deepened, built on shared struggles and a common purpose. The initial awkwardness was gone, replaced by a comfortable, easy camaraderie. They laughed together, sometimes at their own ridiculous situation, sometimes at a small joke. They were no longer just a rancher and a hired wife. They were partners, allies, and something more, something that neither of them dared to name. They were a team. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. Ilara leaned her head against the wooden post, tired but content. "Do you think we can do it, Caleb?" she asked softly. "Can we really convince them?" He turned to her, his face a gentle mask in the fading light. "We won't just convince them, Ilara," he said, his voice full of a quiet conviction. "We'll become it, a real family." His words were a promise, a beacon of hope in the storm. The court date was a looming threat, but for the first time Ilara wasn't afraid. She was ready. She had Caleb, she had Maeve, and she had a purpose. She was fighting for something real, something worth more than all the money in the world. The days leading up to the court-appointed visit were a flurry of activity. The ranch was spotless, the house was a welcoming home, and Caleb and Ilara had memorized their roles as husband and wife, partners in a shared life. They even practiced their interactions, their hands brushing as they passed tools, their voices soft with a practiced intimacy. The line between performance and reality blurred more with each passing day. One evening, as they were setting the table for dinner, Maeve walked into the kitchen holding a drawing. She walked to Ilara and held it up. It was a picture of a stick-figure family, a tall man with a cowboy hat, a woman with long hair, and a little girl in the middle. The drawing was simple, but the message was profound. She had drawn them as a family. Ilara's eyes welled up with tears. "It's beautiful, sweetie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Caleb, who was standing still, his gaze fixed on the drawing. A look of raw, unadulterated love for his daughter was etched on his face. She drew us," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. Ilara knelt down, pulling Maeve into a hug. "She did. We're a family, sweetie." Maeve hugged her back, her small arms wrapped tightly around Ilara's neck. Then, to Ilara's surprise, she looked at Caleb and held out her arms. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then knelt and wrapped his arms around both of them, a protective fortress. For a brief moment, they were a real family, a perfect, unbroken circle of love. The next day, the court representative arrived. It was a stern-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of detached professionalism. He was accompanied by a lawyer from the Whitlock's firm, a young, ambitious man with a condescending smirk. They began their inspection, their questions pointed and probing. They asked Ilara about Caleb's habits, his routine, his temperament. They asked Caleb about Ilara's background, her skills, her relationship with Maeve. Ilara and Caleb answered every question with a calm, practiced ease, their words and their actions synchronized with a quiet perfection. "Mrs. Tanner," the court representative said, his eyes sharp, "we've heard that your past is complicated, that you were in a difficult financial situation before you married Mr. Tanner." Ilara met his gaze, her chin held high. "Yes, that's true. My late husband left me with a debt I couldn't repay, but my past is my own. It has no bearing on my ability to be a good wife and mother. I am a hard worker and I love this family. I am here because I chose to be here." The lawyer from the Whitlock's firm smirked. "You chose to be here for money. It was a business arrangement, wasn't it?" Caleb stepped forward, his body a solid wall between Ilara and the lawyer. "It started that way," he said, his voice low and dangerous. But it isn't a business arrangement anymore. This is my wife, and she is the best thing that has ever happened to this family. She has brought light back into this house, and she has given me back my daughter. I will not have you or anyone else question her motives." The lawyer seemed to shrink back a bit, taken aback by Caleb's ferocity. The court representative, however, looked at Caleb with a newfound respect. He saw not a man on the verge of losing his child, but a man fighting for his family. "And you, Mr. Tanner," the lawyer pressed, his voice shaky, "what if we were to expose the fact that your marriage is a fraud?" Caleb looked at him, his stormy eyes filled with a raw, undeniable sincerity. "Then you would be wrong," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, powerful conviction. "Because this isn't a fraud. It's a promise to my daughter, a promise to my wife, and a promise to myself. We are a family. You can't take that away from us." The court representative looked from Caleb to Ilara, and then to Maeve, who was standing in the doorway, her little hand in Jed's. She was watching them, a look of hope in her eyes. The representative saw the love in Caleb's eyes when he looked at Ilara, the way Ilara's hand instinctively went to Maeve's head, the way Maeve leaned against Jed, a small but significant gesture of trust. He saw a family, not a legal arrangement. He nodded slowly, a small smile on his face. "Thank you, Mr. Tanner, Mrs. Tanner. I believe I have everything I need." As the carriage rumbled away, Ilara and Caleb stood on the porch, a sense of shared relief washing over them. They had done it. They had convinced them, but in a way they had also convinced themselves. They had become the family they pretended to be. Caleb turned to her, his gaze soft and filled with a warmth she had never seen before. "We did it, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "We did it." He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. It was a simple touch, but it held a world of unspoken gratitude, of respect, and of a burgeoning affection that was deeper and more profound than either of them could have imagined. Ilara leaned into his touch, her heart soaring. The contract was a distant memory. The future was a blank page, and for the first time she was excited to see what they would write on it, together. The dust of the carriage settled on the long road leading away from the Tanner ranch, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with anticipation, but light with a sense of triumph. Caleb and Ilara stood on the porch, watching until the small black speck of the vehicle vanished on the horizon. A shared breath of relief escaped them. They had done it. They had faced the Inquisition, and for now, they had won. A small sound from the doorway drew their attention. Maeve was peeking out, her little face filled with a fragile hope. Ilara knelt and opened her arms. The girl ran to her, a small, trusting gesture that felt like a reward more precious than any court ruling. "They're gone, sweetie," Ilara whispered, holding her tight. "Everything is all right." Maeve looked up, her gaze shifting from Ilara to Caleb, and for the first time, her grey eyes held a question. "Are you staying?" The unspoken plea was clear. Caleb knelt beside Ilara, his large hand coming to rest on Maeve's back. "Yes, little one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're staying." The family of three sat on the porch steps, the Texas sun setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple. The silence was comfortable, filled with a new kind of intimacy. The shared challenge had stripped away the last layers of their pretense, leaving them with an honest, raw bond. Later that evening, as the stars began to pepper the darkening sky, Ilara sat in the living room mending one of Caleb's shirts. Caleb entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into her hands. He sat in the chair across from her, the firelight flickering across his face, softening the harsh lines. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. Ilara looked up from her sewing. "For what?" "For everything," he answered simply. "For not walking away when the going got rough. For standing with me today. For bringing Maeve back to life." His words hit her with a profound force. This was not the man who had hired her for a job. This was a man who saw her, who valued her, who was finally opening up the walled-off parts of his heart. "You would have done the same for her," she said, her voice soft. She's your daughter." He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. "I wouldn't have known how. Before you." This house was a place of ghosts. Maeve was a ghost. I was a ghost. We were just two people living in a silent tomb. He took a sip of his coffee. "You brought color back. You brought light." Ilara's heart ached with a tenderness she had never felt before. She understood his grief, the way it had consumed him. She had been consumed by her own sorrow and fear. She put her sewing aside and looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "We're not ghosts anymore, Caleb. We're real." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she dared not name. It was raw, vulnerable, and deeply affecting. He leaned forward, and for a moment she thought he would kiss her. Her breath hitched in her throat, her body tensing in anticipation. The moment stretched, a fragile, unspoken question hanging between them. Then he simply reached out and gently brushed a stray thread from her cheek. "Good night, Ilara," he said, his voice husky. "And thank you for everything." He stood and walked away, leaving Ilara with the warmth of his coffee, the scent of his presence, and a heart that was pounding a little faster than it should. The victory over the Whitlocks was a professional one, but the victory over their own fears, over the walls they had built around their hearts, was a personal one, and it had just begun. Ilara knew then that their contract was no longer just about a year of her life. It was about a lifetime of a future she hadn't known she was looking for. The ranch life, so full of predictable routines, was also filled with sudden, dangerous moments. Ilara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the days, the clatter of pots and pans, the silent presence of Maeve, the distant sounds of Caleb and Jed working. But one morning, the silence was shattered by a sharp, splitting sound, followed by a man's cry of pain. Ilara was in the garden with Maeve, teaching her to identify the different herbs. The sound froze her. It came from the direction of the south pasture, where Caleb had been clearing some fallen timber. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Maeve," she said, her voice low and firm, "stay here. Don't move. I'll be right back." The girl's eyes widened, a flicker of fear in them, but she nodded, trusting Ilara. Ilara ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She raced past the barn and over the rise, the sound of her own ragged breathing her only companion. As she crested the hill, she saw him. Caleb was on the ground, his leg trapped under a large, gnarled tree trunk. Jed was beside him, his face a mask of panicked helplessness. "Ilara, stay back!" Caleb shouted, his voice a strained grunt. Ilara ignored him. She ran to his side, her mind racing. The weight of the log was immense. It had to be a couple of 1,000 pounds. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The winch snapped," Jed explained, his voice trembling. "The log shifted. We were trying to get it out." Caleb's face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was in agony, but his eyes were focused on the task at hand. "Go get help. Go to town, Jed. Get a doctor. Get the men." Ilara looked at him, her mind clear. A trip to town would take hours. Caleb couldn't wait. "We can lift it," she said, her voice firm. Jed looked at her like she was crazy. "Ma'am, we can't. It's too heavy." "We have to try," she insisted. She looked at Caleb. "Caleb, I need you to tell me what to do. Fast. Where's the spare winch? The chain?" Caleb looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his pained eyes. "Barn's tool shed," he grunted. "Big one. On the wall." Ilara didn't hesitate. "Jed, you're with me." They ran back to the barn, their footsteps a frantic rhythm. Ilara found the spare winch on the wall, a heavy, intricate piece of machinery. It was too much for one person. She and Jed carried it, stumbling back to the fallen log. Caleb watched them, a grim look on his face. "Okay," Ilara said, her mind working through the problem. She looked at the log, at the angle of Caleb's leg. "Jed, we need to anchor the winch to that tree over there." She pointed to a sturdy oak. "Caleb, is there another chain?" "Wagon bed." "Small—" "On the floor," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They worked as a team, Ilara directing, her voice calm and authoritative, Jed following her instructions with a newfound respect. They anchored the winch, ran the chain under the log, and began to crank the lever. The winch groaned under the strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the log began to shift, an inch at a time. "It's moving!" Jed exclaimed, a note of triumph in his voice. Ilara's muscles strained, her knuckles white on the crank. Her mind was focused on one thing, getting that log off of Caleb. She pushed with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Finally, with a final protesting creak, the log lifted just enough. "Now, Caleb!" she shouted. "Pull your leg out!" He grunted in pain, but he pulled, and with a final tearing motion, he was free. He collapsed back on the ground, his face pale, his breath coming in short, painful bursts. Ilara dropped the crank and rushed to him, her hands gentle as she examined his leg. It was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken. "It's bad," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "It's a clean break, I think, but we have to get you to the house. We have to splint it." Jed ran back to the barn for the wagon. Ilara stayed with Caleb, holding his hand, her gaze locked on his. He was in pain, but his eyes held a quiet gratitude, a deep admiration. She had not only saved him, she had taken charge, her courage and clear-headedness a sharp contrast to his own usual stoicism. She was a woman who could rise to the occasion, a woman who had a quiet strength he was only now beginning to understand. As Jed returned with the wagon, Ilara helped him lift Caleb, her hands gentle but firm. Caleb gritted his teeth, not making a sound. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain and awe. The woman he had hired to be a wife for a year had just saved his life, and in that moment, their roles, their contract, their past, none of it mattered. There was only the present, and the undeniable truth that they were in this together. Caleb's injury was severe. The nearest doctor was in town, and a quick examination confirmed Ilara's suspicions. A badly broken tibia and fibula. He was in immense pain, and the doctor gave him some laudanum to help, but told him to expect to be bedridden for at least a month, and off his feet for much longer. The diagnosis was a blow, not just to Caleb, but to the entire ranch. It was cattle drive season, and without a foreman the work would fall behind. The Whitlock's lawyers would hear about the injury, and it would be another point of contention against him, a man who was not fit to run a ranch, let alone raise a child. In the first few days, a wave of despair washed over Caleb. He was a man of action, of physical labor, and being confined to a bed was like a prison sentence. He was surly, frustrated, and silent, the walls of his stoicism back in place. Ilara, however, was not one to back down. She had a ranch to run and a family to protect. She sat at his bedside, a notepad and pencil in her hand. "Talk to me, Caleb," she said, her voice firm. "What needs to be done? The cattle, the fences, the supplies?" He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Ilara, you can't. It's too much. The men, they won't listen to a woman." "They will if I have you backing me," she countered. "Tell me what needs to be done. We don't have time to waste." Reluctantly, he began to talk. He explained the grazing rotation, the number of cattle to be moved, the amount of feed that needed to be ordered. He told her about the schedule of the ranch hands, about the upcoming branding. Ilara listened intently, writing everything down, her mind absorbing the information with a frightening speed. The next morning, Ilara walked out to the bunkhouse. Jed and the other two ranch hands were milling about, a sense of aimlessness in the air. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Morning, men," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Caleb is laid up for a while. So, he's put me in charge." A few of the men chuckled under their breath, but Jed, who had seen her courage and quick thinking, stood up straight, his expression one of respect. "What do you need us to do, Mom?" he asked. Ilara didn't hesitate. She looked at her notes, her mind already forming a plan. "Jed, you and Hank are on fence patrol today. The south pasture fence is down from the storm last week. The cattle can't get out there. And Tom, you'll be with me. We need to go over the inventory of feed and supplies. Caleb says we're running low." The men looked at each other, then back at Ilara. Her confidence was unwavering. She was not asking for their permission. She was giving them orders. Jed nodded, and the others, seeing his acquiescence, followed suit. That day, Ilara worked tirelessly. She rode in the wagon with Tom to the supply shack, her mind calculating the amount of feed needed for the next month. She went to the bunkhouse and helped prepare meals for the men, her hands sore from the unaccustomed work. She managed the household, tended to Maeve, and still found time to sit at Caleb's bedside, giving him a full report on the day's progress. "The south pasture fence is mended," she said one evening, her voice tired but triumphant. "And I ordered 2 more tons of grain. The men are doing a good job." Caleb watched her, a look of profound admiration on his face. She was not just a wife, she was a partner. She was a rancher. She had taken a world she knew nothing about and mastered it, all for him, all for them. He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. The simple touch was a quiet acknowledgement of his gratitude, a silent apology for his initial doubt. "You're amazing, Ilara," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Ilara's heart fluttered. The heat of his hand, the sincerity in his voice, it was more potent than any declaration of love. He was not just saying the words, he was living them. He was not just dependent on her, he was relying on her, trusting her with his life, with his ranch, with his entire world. The woman who had been a desperate widow, a hired wife, was now the woman in charge, and she was strong enough for the task. The nights were the hardest for Caleb. His leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and the laudanum did little to dull the pain of his guilt and his forced inaction. Ilara would sit with him, her presence a calming influence. She would read to him from a worn-out copy of a newspaper, or just sit in comfortable silence, her hand in his. One night, as he was shifting uncomfortably, his pain was a palpable presence in the room. Ilara went to get a fresh compress for his leg. As she was tidying his nightstand, her eyes fell on a small leather locket. It was tucked under his pillow as if he wanted to keep it close. She knew what it was. It was a piece of Sarah, a remnant of a love he had lost. She hesitated, her hand hovering over it. She felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, surprising emotion. She had no right to feel it, but it was there. She was the woman who lived in his house, who cared for his daughter, who was building a life with him. But she knew she would always be in the shadow of a ghost. Ilara picked up the locket. It was worn with use, the leather soft from 1,000 touches. She opened it. Inside were 2 small, faded photographs. One was of a beautiful, smiling woman with dark hair and bright eyes. The other was of a tiny, rosy-cheeked baby, a baby who had never lived. A single perfect tear welled in Ilara's eye. The sheer, brutal finality of it all was overwhelming. "It was her," a low voice said from the bed. Ilara turned, her hand still holding the locket. Caleb was awake, his gaze fixed on her. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with a grief that time had not diminished. "And our son." Ilara sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm so sorry, Caleb." She held the locket out to him, but he just shook his head. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "She was my life. I don't think I'll ever get over it." "You don't have to," Ilara said, her voice soft with understanding. "You'll never get over losing someone you love. You learn to live with it. You learn to carry the grief, and you learn to let the love live on." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "You speak as if you know." "I do," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she remembered her own loss. "My husband, he wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, but I loved him. And when he died, I felt like a part of me died with him. I thought I would be a widow forever, a woman who only looked back, but I couldn't. I had to look forward, for my own sake." She held up the locket. "You carry their memory with you. You let it be a part of you. But you don't let it stop you from living." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I thought I was moving on, but then you came and... You're a force of nature, Ilara. You've brought so much life into this house, so much love, and it makes the loss feel that much more profound. Because I know now what it's like to love again." The words hung in the air, a confession that was both breathtaking and terrifying. He had not said, "I love you," but he had said something close. He had acknowledged that his heart was not a closed book, but an open one. And Ilara's heart, which had been so afraid of being a stand-in, a temporary replacement, felt a surge of hope. "I'm not a replacement, Caleb," she said, her voice a whisper. "I'm a new chapter." He pulled her closer, his hand gentle on her arm. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, Ilara saw a glimmer of a future she hadn't dared to dream of, a future that was not a business arrangement, but a new, beautiful story, one they would write together, a story that would honor the past without being defined by it. The silence from the Whitlocks was more unsettling than their previous aggression. It was the calm before the storm. Ilara, now deeply entrenched in the running of the ranch, kept her ears open for any news from town. She had a network of informers now. The feed store owner, the general store clerk, the local bartender, they all knew Caleb and they respected him, and they had all heard the rumors. The news finally came from Jed, who had been to town for supplies. He returned with a grim look on his face. "Caleb," he said, his voice low, "there's a new face in town. A man from New York, they say. He's been asking questions about you, and about the ranch." Caleb, now hobbling around with the aid of a crutch, his leg in a cast, listened intently. "What kind of questions?" "He's been asking about the ranch's finances," Jed said, his gaze shifting to Ilara. "And he's been asking about the woman who came here from the east, your wife." Ilara's blood ran cold. The Whitlocks. They had sent an investigator, a man who would dig into her past, who would find the creditors, the foreclosure notices, the whispers of a desperate widow. They were not just trying to prove the marriage was a sham. They were trying to prove that Ilara was a fraud, a gold digger who had married Caleb for his money. "They're not just fighting for custody anymore," Ilara said, her voice trembling. "They're trying to destroy us." Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're not just fighting for custody," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're trying to get their hands on this land. My wife Sarah left Maeve the ranch. But if I'm declared unfit, if Maeve is declared unfit, the Whitlocks get a claim to the property. This has always been about greed." The revelation was a bitter pill to swallow. Ilara looked at Caleb, and for the first time, she saw the full extent of the burden he had been carrying. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter. He was fighting to protect his late wife's legacy, to protect the land that was all he had left of her. "What do we do?" Ilara asked, her mind racing. "We stick to the plan," Caleb said, his voice firm. "We don't let him see the cracks. We show him a family. We show him a well-run ranch. We don't give him anything to use against us." But Ilara knew it wasn't enough. The man from New York was a professional. He wouldn't be fooled by a show. They needed to anticipate his moves. "He'll try to get to Maeve," she said, her voice a low whisper. "He'll try to get her to talk about Sarah's death. About you. He'll try to scare her." Caleb's face went pale. The thought of anyone hurting Maeve was a torment to him. He was a fighter, but he was a man of the land, not a man of legal cunning. He looked at Ilara, and in her eyes he saw a fierce, protective fire he knew he could rely on. "We won't let him," Ilara said, her voice filled with a steely resolve. "We won't let him near her. We'll be her shield." The next few days were filled with a quiet dread. Ilara and Caleb kept Maeve close. They took her on long rides in the wagon. They played with her in the yard. They sat with her for hours, just being present. They were a fortress, but they knew a single crack could bring the whole wall down. The man, a smooth-talking, well-dressed individual named Leland Thorne, finally showed up at the ranch. He was not as obvious as the Whitlocks. He was polite, charming, and his questions at first were innocuous. He spoke of investments, of buying up land in the West. But his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He noticed the way Ilara and Caleb held themselves, the way they interacted. He noticed the quiet contentment of Maeve. He was a professional. He was a snake in the grass, and he was there to poison their peace. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the bond that had formed between the rancher and the widow. He had underestimated the ferocity of a love that was not born of a contract but of a shared struggle. And Ilara knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that they were ready for him. Leland Thorne stayed in town, but his presence was a constant, unnerving pressure. He would send out riders, men who would ask prying questions of Jed and the ranch hands. He would linger outside the general store, trying to catch Ilara alone. He was a predator, patient and cunning. One afternoon, Ilara was alone at the well, drawing water. She had sent Maeve inside for a nap. As she was pulling the bucket up, a shadow fell over her. It was Thorn. "Mrs. Tanner," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I've been hoping to catch you alone. I'm with a firm that's interested in a partnership with your husband." Ilara's grip on the bucket handle tightened. "My husband handles all the business of the ranch." "I'm sure he does," Thorn said, his voice filled with a condescending tone. "But I'm sure you have your own interests, your own problems. I've heard you came to this marriage with some baggage, a considerable amount of debt, if I'm not mistaken." Ilara's heart pounded. He had found out. "My past is my business." "Perhaps," he said, his smile cold and calculating. "But it becomes my business when it affects the welfare of a minor child. The Whitlocks are a very influential family, Mrs. Tanner. They have a deep concern for their granddaughter. They believe she deserves a more stable home, one not built on a foundation of lies." He leaned closer, his voice a low, insidious whisper. "I can make all of your problems go away, Mrs. Tanner. All you have to do is tell me the truth. Admit this is a business arrangement. Admit you are in it for the money. And I will ensure you get a handsome sum, more than Mr. Tanner will ever pay you." Ilara looked at him, and for a moment the temptation was real. The money was life-changing. It was a way to truly be free. But then she thought of Caleb's face, of the silent trust in his eyes. She thought of Maeve, of the way she laughed when they played in the creek, of the little drawing she had made. She thought of the home they had built, brick by brick, moment by moment. It was not a fraud, it was their reality. "Get off my land," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. Thorn's smile vanished. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Ilara said, her hand instinctively going for the shotgun Caleb kept hidden behind the well. It was a bluff, but she hoped he wouldn't know. "I don't know who you are or what you're doing here, but this is my home, and this is my family. You will not threaten me. You will not threaten my husband, and you will not threaten my daughter. Now get off my land before I'm forced to defend it." Thorn's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a frightened woman, a desperate widow. He had not expected a protector, a warrior. He took a step back, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Just then Caleb appeared from around the corner, his crutch thumping against the ground. "Everything all right here, Ilara?" he asked, his voice a low, menacing rumble. His gaze was fixed on Thorn, and the anger radiating from him was a palpable thing. Thorn recovered quickly, his charming mask back in place. "Yes, Mr. Tanner. Just a friendly conversation. Mrs. Tanner was just explaining her position." "I see," Caleb said, his eyes narrowed. He walked to Ilara and stood beside her, his body a solid, protective barrier. "Ilara has a way of making her position very clear. I suggest you listen to her. We have nothing to discuss. You have your answer." Thorn gave a curt nod. "I'll be seeing you in court then, Mr. Tanner." He tipped his hat to Ilara. "A pleasure, Mrs. Tanner." He walked away, a silent promise of revenge in his every step. Ilara and Caleb stood together, their hands brushing, a silent acknowledgement of the victory. They had held the line. They had faced the threat together, and they had not backed down. The moment was fraught with tension, with fear, with a new, potent kind of intimacy. The battle was far from over, but they had won this round. And Ilara knew that her love for Caleb was not just an emotion, it was a weapon, and she would use it to fight for the future they were building together. The confrontation with Thorn left a profound mark on Ilara and Caleb. The pretense, the initial business arrangement, had been completely annihilated. They were now a united front, fighting for their family, their home, and their future. The line between their roles had blurred to the point of non-existence. They were no longer a rancher and a hired wife. They were a man and a woman in love. One night after a long day of work, Ilara was sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the deepening twilight. Caleb came and sat beside her, his crutch resting against the porch post. The silence was comfortable, filled with the easy rhythm of their shared life. "He was going to pay me," Ilara said, her voice a low whisper. "Thorn. He offered me money to lie." Caleb turned to her, his face a mask of concern. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't an offer," she said, her voice filled with a fierce conviction. "It was a test, and I passed. I would never have taken it, Caleb, never. The money doesn't matter anymore. This is what matters." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not just loyalty, but a deep, profound affection. "I came here for money. That's the truth. I was desperate. I was running from my past. But you gave me a purpose, you and Maeve. You gave me a future I didn't know I wanted. I'm not a fraud, Caleb. My love for this family is real." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. The simple touch was filled with a world of unspoken emotion. "I know," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. "I saw it. I saw it in your eyes when you looked at Maeve. I saw it when you took charge of the ranch. I saw it today when you stood up to that man." He paused, his gaze fixed on hers. "And I feel it too, Ilara. I was so afraid of loving again. I was so afraid of losing someone again. But I can't. I can't live without you." His words hung in the air, a breathtaking confession that took her breath away. The unspoken had finally been said. The fragile, beautiful thing that had been growing between them was now a concrete, undeniable truth. "Caleb," she said, her voice a whisper. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I love you, Ilara. I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving again." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. She had been so afraid of this moment, so afraid of her own feelings, of being a stand-in for a woman he had loved and lost. But his words were not a comparison. They were a confession, a new beginning. She reached out and gently cupped his cheek, her hand soft against his rough skin. "I love you too, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with a raw, undeniable sincerity. "I have for a while." He closed his eyes, a profound sense of relief washing over his face. He had been so afraid of saying the words, of being vulnerable, but in her gentle touch, in her whispered confession, he knew he had made the right choice. He had opened his heart, and in doing so, he had found his home. And in that moment, under the vast, star-filled sky, they both knew that their future was no longer about a contract. It was about a promise of a love that was stronger than any legal document, a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places, and a love that was worth fighting for. The morning after their confession, an almost unbearable tenderness hung in the air. The unspoken had been spoken, the chasm between them had been bridged. They moved through their daily tasks with a new rhythm, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting with a silent understanding. A shy, tentative joy filled the house, a warmth that had been missing for years. Maeve, with the intuition of a child, sensed the shift. She was more relaxed, more open. She would follow Caleb around the ranch, a silent shadow to his crutch. She would sit with Ilara for hours, just being, her presence a silent testament to the peace she felt. One afternoon, Ilara and Caleb were sitting on the porch, a long, comfortable silence between them. Maeve was playing on the grass, humming a soft, tuneless song. She had a small stick in her hand, and she was drawing in the dirt. Suddenly, a small, stray dog, a shaggy mongrel, wandered onto the property. He was thin and had a limp. Maeve saw him and froze, her body tensing. She had never been afraid of animals, but the dog's limping gait seemed to trigger something within her. She dropped the stick, her small body trembling. The dog whimpered, sensing her fear, and took a tentative step toward her. "Maeve," Caleb said, his voice low. "It's all right, honey. He's not going to hurt you." But Maeve didn't move. She just stared at the dog, a look of pure, unadulterated terror on her face. Her eyes were wide, and a single silent tear rolled down her cheek. Ilara's heart ached for her. She knew what this was about. The dog's limp was a trigger, a reminder of the fragility of life, a physical manifestation of her own pain. She ran to her, wrapping her arms around her, holding her tight. "It's all right, sweetie," she whispered. He's just scared. He's just hurt. Maeve, her body still trembling, looked at the dog. She then looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "He's all alone, Ilara," she said, her voice a small, strained whisper. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. Those were the first words Maeve had spoken in years, and they were not just words. They were a cry for help, a cry for understanding. "Yes, sweetie," Ilara said, her voice thick with emotion. "He is. He's lost and scared, just like you were." Maeve looked at the dog, and a look of understanding, of empathy passed over her face. She took a small, hesitant step towards the dog. Caleb, who had been watching the scene unfold, his face a mask of shock and awe, finally found his voice. "Maeve, honey," he said, his voice trembling, Don't go too close." Maeve ignored him. She knelt down and held out her hand to the dog. The dog, sensing her gentle spirit, took a hesitant step forward and sniffed her hand. Then, with a sigh of what seemed like pure relief, he laid his head on her lap. Maeve gently stroked the dog's head, her face filled with a new, beautiful light. She looked at Ilara and Caleb, a small, triumphant smile on her face. "He needs a home," she said, her voice soft but clear. Ilara and Caleb looked at each other, tears streaming down their faces. Maeve wasn't just talking. She was communicating. She was seeing the world again, seeing its pain and its beauty. She had found a purpose, a connection, a way to heal. She had found a way to let her voice out. Caleb hobbled over, a look of profound love and gratitude on his face. He knelt beside Ilara, and he pulled them both into a tight hug, his body a protective fortress. He had been so focused on fighting a legal battle, on protecting his daughter from the outside world, that he hadn't realized the real battle was within her. And Ilara, the woman he had hired, had won it. She had healed his daughter, and in the process, she had healed him. He held them both, his heart full to bursting. They were a family, and they were a family that was no longer broken, but whole. The dog, whom Maeve immediately named Rusty because of the rusty color of his fur, became a part of the family. He followed Maeve everywhere, a silent, limping shadow. His presence was a constant reminder of the breakthrough, of the beautiful moment that had brought Maeve's voice back. The day after, the court's final ruling arrived in the mail. It was a single, concise letter. The case against Caleb was dismissed. The Whitlocks' claims had been found to be without merit. The marriage was legal, the home was stable, and Maeve was thriving. Caleb had won. He had won the legal battle, but he knew the real victory was in the silent house that was no longer silent, in the heart that had been closed and was now open, and in the woman who had brought light back into his life. He found Ilara in the kitchen, washing dishes. He walked up to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to do this right. He had to show her what she meant to him. He reached out and gently turned her to face him. Her hands were wet, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a question. "We won, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. "The court dismissed the case. They're not going to bother us anymore." A look of profound relief washed over her face. She threw her arms around him, a spontaneous, joyous hug. "Oh, Caleb, I knew it. I knew we could do it." He held her tight, his heart filled with a joy he hadn't felt in years. He pulled back and looked at her, his gaze filled with a love that was raw, honest, and completely real. "The contract is over, Ilara," he said, his voice low. "Our year is up. You fulfilled your end of the bargain. I can pay you the final sum. You can go back to your life. You're free." Ilara's smile wavered. A look of profound sadness washed over her face. "Go back," she whispered. "I don't have a life to go back to, Caleb. This is my life now." He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I know," he said. "I didn't mean it that way. I meant, the contract is over. But our life is just beginning. I don't want to live without you. I don't want to live without you and Maeve. I love you, Ilara. I love you, and I want you to be my wife, my real wife, for all time." Ilara's eyes welled up with tears. He wasn't asking her to stay as a part of a deal. He was asking her to stay as a part of his life, as a part of his family. He wasn't asking for her to be a stand-in. He was asking for her to be a partner. "Yes, Caleb," she whispered, her voice filled with a raw, undeniable sincerity. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." He leaned in, his lips finding hers. The kiss was not a desperate one or a hurried one. It was a kiss of homecoming, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of loss and desperation, and that had emerged stronger, purer, and more powerful than either of them could have imagined. It was a kiss that sealed their new life, their new family, their new love. It was a kiss of a second chance. And it was a kiss that promised a future that would be filled with not just survival, but with happiness, with love, and with the joy of a little girl who had found her voice and, in doing so, had made her family whole. The victory over the Whitlocks, celebrated in the quiet solitude of the Tanner Ranch, felt like a breath of fresh air. The legal documents confirming the dismissal of the case were more than just paper. They were a testament to the family they had become. The past was no longer a cage, but a story they had overcome. Caleb's broken leg, now healing, felt less like a burden and more like a scar of a battle won. The ranch, under Ilara's capable management, was thriving. Maeve's voice, once a fragile whisper, was now a constant, joyful presence in their lives. For a week, the ranch was an oasis of peace, but a storm was brewing on the horizon, one far more dangerous than the legal wrangling of the past. The Whitlocks, a family accustomed to getting their way through money and influence, were not ones to accept defeat. They had been humiliated in court, their malice exposed, their greed laid bare. They sought not just victory, but revenge. The first sign came in the form of small unsettling events: a gate left ajar, allowing a few head of cattle to stray, a section of fence cut with a clean, sharp blade, a bale of hay that was mysteriously soaked and spoiled. Caleb, hobbling around the property, dismissed them at first. Just a careless mistake, he'd say, but Ilara, her senses honed by the instinct to protect, knew better. The events were too precise, too deliberate. One evening, Jed came to the house, his face grim. "Caleb," he said, "I found something down by the creek, a campfire and boot tracks. They're not ours, and they're fresh." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Rustlers?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jed shook his head. They weren't looking for cattle. They were watching the main herd. And the house. A cold dread settled in Ilara's stomach. This wasn't about theft. It was about intimidation. It was about making them feel unsafe on their own land. It was about making them pay. That night, a series of gunshots rang out in the distance. They were not close, but they were a clear message. The men were out there. They were watching. Caleb's frustration was a palpable thing. Confined by his broken leg, he felt a helpless rage. "I need to get out there. I need to get a rifle. I need to show them this land is not theirs for the taking." Ilara placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "No, Caleb, you can't. Your leg. You'll get yourself killed. We'll handle this together." She went to his gun safe and pulled out a rifle, a powerful .30-30 Winchester he kept for emergencies. She had watched him clean and load it 100 times. She knew how to use it. She didn't have his expert marksmanship, but she had a steady hand and a fierce determination. She checked the chamber, her movements precise and calm. "I'll take the night watch," she said, her voice filled with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "You'll stay inside and you'll stay with Maeve. She needs to feel safe." Caleb looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not the scared widow he had met months ago, but a woman transformed by purpose. She was ready to defend their home, their family, their future. He was a man of action, but his hands were tied. He had to trust her. He had to trust the woman he loved. That night, Ilara sat by the front window, the rifle resting on her lap. The ranch was silent, save for the hum of the crickets and the occasional lonely howl of a coyote. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of the old house, put her on edge. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness, her finger resting on the cold steel of the trigger. She was a woman from the city, a woman who had never held a gun in her life, but the protective instinct within her was a force more powerful than any weapon. In the middle of the night, a flicker of light caught her eye. It came from the far side of the barn. She tensed, her hand gripping the rifle. It was a man holding a lit lantern. He was a stranger, tall and lean. He was walking towards the cattle pens, a can of something in his hand. She knew what it was. Kerosene. A cold rage, a primal fury washed over her. He was going to burn them out. He was going to destroy everything they had worked for. She raised the rifle, her aim true, but she couldn't shoot. The shot would alert the other men, and they would be outnumbered. She had to think. She had to be smart. She looked at the barn, at the pens, at the sleeping cattle. She looked back at the house, at the window of Maeve's room, at the soft glow of the lamp in Caleb's room. She had a family to protect. She couldn't risk a gunfight. Not yet. She went to the back door, her movements silent and swift. She opened it and stepped out into the night. She kept to the shadows, her body a silent whisper in the darkness. She moved towards the man, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to stop him. As she got closer, she saw the second man. He was standing on a rise, a rifle in his hands, acting as a lookout. He was watching the house. She had only one option. She had to take out the man with the kerosene first. She found a heavy rock, a large, jagged piece of granite. She crept closer, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. The man was oblivious, his back to her, his focus on the pens. She raised the rock, and with a swift, powerful motion, she brought it down on the kerosene can. The can crumpled with a loud clang, and the liquid spilled onto the ground. The man jumped, startled. He turned to face her, his eyes wide with surprise. "What the—" he began. Before he could finish, Ilara lunged, her body a blur of motion. She hit him with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, knocking him to the ground. She landed on top of him, her hands at his throat, her mind a whirlwind of rage and fear. "Don't you dare touch this ranch," she hissed, her voice a low, terrifying growl. "Don't you dare!" He was a big man, but he was unprepared. He struggled, but her fury was a strength he couldn't match. In the distance, she heard a shout from the lookout. The other man had seen them. "Run!" she shouted, her voice a raw scream of desperation. "Get out of here!" She didn't wait for him to respond. She got up and ran back to the house, a blur of motion in the darkness. She burst through the front door, slamming it shut and locking it. She ran to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The man she had tackled was on his feet, stumbling away. The other man was running after him, their silhouettes fading into the night. Caleb was at the door in an instant, his crutch forgotten, his face filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. "What happened?" he demanded. Ilara's body was shaking, her hands trembling. She had just faced down a man who was going to destroy their home. She had just stood her ground against a threat she knew nothing about. She looked at Caleb, and in his eyes she saw a love that was deeper than any word. "I stopped them," she said, her voice a whisper. "I stopped them, they're gone." Caleb pulled her into a tight hug, his arms a protective shield around her. "You are the bravest woman I've ever known, Ilara Tanner," he whispered into her hair. He held her for a long time, the silence of the night no longer a threat but a testament to her courage. They had survived the night. But Ilara knew the fight was far from over. The foiled attack on the ranch was not an isolated incident. The next few days were a blur of tension and vigilance. The men from the Whitlock's payroll, now exposed as arsonists and vandals, continued to harass them. They'd cut fences, spook the cattle, and leave menacing symbols burned into the dirt. The legal battle was over, but the war for the ranch was just beginning. Caleb, confined to his bed for the most part, was a strategist, his mind a whirlwind of plans and counter-plans. He directed Ilara, who was now a full-fledged field commander, a force of nature in her own right. She rode in the wagon with Jed, her rifle always by her side. She organized the ranch hands, giving them a sense of purpose and a shared enemy. The men who had once been skeptical of her now looked to her for leadership. Her courage and clear-headedness had earned their respect. "They're not trying to steal anything," Caleb said one afternoon. his voice low as he looked over a map of the property with Ilara. "They're trying to make me bleed. They're trying to make me so tired of fighting that I'll sell the land." Ilara's hand clenched into a fist. "They don't know who they're dealing with," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "They don't know what we've been through. We're not giving up. Not on this land. Not on this family." That evening, as the sun began to set, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was not one of the Whitlock's men. He was dressed in the dusty garb of a cattle rustler. He came to a halt by the front gate, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He was a dangerous man, and his presence was a clear threat. Ilara and Caleb were on the porch watching him. "What does he want?" Ilara asked, her hand instinctively going to her rifle. "He's not here to talk," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He's a hired gun, a message from the Whitlocks. They want to scare us off." The man dismounted and walked towards the house, his spurs jingling with each step. He stopped at a respectable distance and yelled, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Caleb Tanner, we have a proposition for you. Sell the land and the trouble goes away. Refuse and you'll be buried in it." Caleb, his face a mask of cold fury, stepped forward, his crutch thumping against the ground. "This land is not for sale, and you can tell the Whitlocks that they're a coward for sending a hired hand to do their dirty work." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a brave man, Tanner, but bravery won't feed your family when we burn your fields and scatter your herds. A man can only fight so long before he breaks." He then looked at Ilara, a malicious smirk on his face. "And your little woman looks like she's about to break already. Let her have the money and run, Tanner. She's not one of you, she's just an interloper." A cold rage, a primal fury washed over Ilara. He was not just threatening them, he was trying to break their bond, to sow discord between them. He was using her past, her history, as a weapon against them. She stepped forward, her voice a low, terrifying growl. "I am Ilara Tanner," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, powerful conviction. "And this is my home, and my family. I came here as a woman with nothing, and I have found everything. You will not break us, we are a team." The man's smirk vanished. He was a predator, but he had never faced a prey that was not only unafraid, but also filled with a protective fury that was far more dangerous than his own. He turned and got back on his horse, his eyes filled with a new grudging respect. "You're a fool, Tanner," he shouted as he rode away. "And you're a fool, woman. But you're both fools who fight." The threat was real, and it was escalating. The Whitlocks, having lost the legal battle, were now resorting to violence and intimidation. They were not just trying to take the ranch, they were trying to break Caleb's spirit, to make him give up. But they had underestimated the power of love, the power of a woman who had found her purpose, and the power of a family that had been forged in the crucible of despair. Caleb and Ilara stood together on the porch, their hands clasped, their gaze fixed on the disappearing silhouette of the hired gun. They were no longer two separate people. They were a single unit, a fortress against the darkness. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. But they would face it together. The rustler's visit was a turning point. It was no longer a battle of wills. It was a physical threat to their lives and their livelihood. Caleb, his frustration a constant, low-burning fire, knew he couldn't just sit and wait for them to strike. He had to take the fight to them. He found Ilara in the barn, cleaning her rifle. Her movements were precise, her focus absolute. She was no longer a woman from the city. She was a woman of the West. She was a rancher. "We need a plan," he said, his voice low. "We can't just wait for them to burn the ranch down." "I know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I have an idea. We need to go back to town. We need to find Thorne." The rustler mentioned a proposition. "He's not just a hired gun, he's a negotiator. He's a middleman, and he's working for the Whitlocks. Thorne is their man on the ground." Caleb's brow furrowed. "He's the last person we should go to, Ilara. He's the enemy." "He's not just the enemy," she countered, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "He's a professional. He's a hired gun, but not a murderer. He has a price. Everyone has a price. The Whitlock's deal is to take the ranch. His deal is to get paid. What if we make a better deal?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and admiration. Her mind worked in a way he had never seen before. She was not just a protector. She was a strategist. She was a woman who could see the angles, who could play the game. "What's your plan?" he asked, a thrill of anticipation running through him. "We go to town," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We confront him. We tell him we know about the rustlers. We tell him we know he's working for the Whitlocks. We tell him we have proof, and we give him an ultimatum. Either he stops this, or we go to the law. We tell them everything. About the court case, about the arson, about the harassment." "He won't stop," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He's too proud. He'll just get more violent." "No," Ilara said, her gaze unwavering. "He won't. He's a professional. A public scandal, a criminal investigation, would ruin him. He's not in the business of violence. He's in the business of getting paid. We'll offer him a deal he can't refuse." Caleb looked at her, a profound sense of awe washing over him. He was a man of the land, a man of simple truths. But Ilara was a woman of complexity, a woman who could navigate the shadows. She was the perfect complement to his strength. She was the brains to his brawn. "What's the deal?" he asked. "We give him a choice," she said, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips. "He can either get paid by the Whitlocks to destroy our ranch and risk a criminal investigation that would ruin his life, or he can tell us everything. Everything the Whitlocks are planning, every detail of their plan. He can give us the information, and in return, we will pay him the same amount the Whitlocks are paying him. But we will pay him to save the ranch, not to destroy it." Caleb stared at her, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. It was brilliant, it was elegant, it was a plan that was so simple, so logical, that it was terrifying. It was a plan that could only have been hatched by a woman who had fought her way out of debt, a woman who had been cornered and had found a way to win. "He'll take the money," Caleb said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "He'll sell them out. It's his nature." "Yes," Ilara said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "He will. Because we're not asking him to do anything illegal. We're asking him to do what he does best. We're asking him to work for us." The next day they went to town. They found Thorne at the local saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as they entered, a flash of surprise in his eyes. He had not expected them to come to him. "Mrs. and Mr. Tanner," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Caleb, his hand on Ilara's back, a silent, protective gesture, met his gaze. "We're here to talk, Thorne," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're here to talk about your friends, the Whitlocks, and we're here to talk about a business deal." Thorne's smirk vanished. He was a professional. He knew a serious proposition when he heard one. He gestured to a small, secluded table in the corner. "Sit down," he said, his voice now devoid of any pretense. "Let's talk." And so, in the smoky darkness of the saloon, they made a pact that would either save their ranch or destroy them. A pact that was not born of love but of necessity. A pact that was a testament to the fact that they were a team, a single, unwavering unit, ready to do whatever it took to protect their home, their family, and their future. Thorne was a man of his word. He took the deal. Greed was his motivator, and the prospect of easy money without the risk of a criminal investigation was too good to pass up. Over the next few days, he met with Caleb and Ilara in secret, giving them every detail of the Whitlocks' plan. The extent of their malice was more profound than they had imagined. The Whitlocks, humiliated by their legal defeat, had not only hired Thorne and the rustlers to harass them, but they had also been systematically trying to sabotage the ranch for months. They had bribed a local veterinarian to give Caleb's cattle a false diagnosis of a contagious disease, a diagnosis that would have led to the destruction of his entire herd. They had paid a man in town to spread rumors about Ilara's past, rumors that were now confirmed to be a calculated campaign to discredit her. They had even gone so far as to pay off a local lawman to turn a blind eye to the rustlers' actions. The web of deceit was vast, a dark, intricate tapestry woven with malice and greed. Ilara's initial suspicions had been right. The Whitlocks were not just fighting for custody, they were fighting to destroy a man and a family, all for the sake of an inheritance they believed was rightfully theirs. "They're not just trying to take the ranch," Caleb said, his voice grim as he looked over the documents Thorne had given them. They're trying to destroy me. They're trying to make me lose everything. My reputation, my livelihood, my home. They're trying to break your spirit, Ilara said, her voice low. But they failed because you didn't give up, and because you have a family now. Thorn, who had been listening in silence, a detached observer to their emotional turmoil, finally spoke. "You're a pair of fools," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You've won the battle, but you haven't won the war. They're not going to stop. Not until you're gone." "Then we'll expose them," Ilara said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "We'll go to the law. We'll show them everything. We'll show them the contracts, the bribes, the payoffs. We'll show them the truth." Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And do you think anyone will believe you? A woman with a questionable past and a man who is a known recluse. You're a liability, Mrs. Tanner. They'll just say you fabricated the evidence. They'll say you're doing this for revenge. You don't have a leg to stand on." His words hit Ilara with a profound force. He was right. Her past was still a cage, a weapon that could be used against her. She had been so focused on protecting Caleb and Maeve that she had forgotten her own vulnerability. Caleb saw the fear in her eyes. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "He's wrong, Ilara," he said, his voice firm. "They won't win. We have something they don't have. We have the truth. And we have each other." That night, they sat together on the porch, a long, quiet silence between them. The information Thorn had given them was a burden, a heavy weight on their shoulders. They had the evidence, but they had no way to use it. The Whitlocks were too powerful, too well connected. They would simply brush it off, and Ilara would be exposed as a fraud, a woman who had married for money. The victory they had fought so hard for would be a hollow one. "What do we do, Caleb?" Ilara whispered, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "We can't just let them get away with it." Caleb sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "We can't go to the law. They'll just spin it. They'll make us look like the criminals." He then looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a new, dangerous resolve. "There is another way. We can go to them. We can confront them. We can show them the evidence, and we can make them an offer. We can put an end to this, once and for all." Ilara's eyes widened. "You mean a final confrontation face to face?" "Yes," he said, his voice low and firm. "We're not running anymore. We're not hiding. We're fighting. We'll go to their home. We'll show them what they're up against. We'll show them that we are not afraid of them. We'll show them that we have the power to destroy their reputation, their family name, their legacy. We'll show them that we are not just a man and a woman. We are a family, and we're not to be trifled with." Ilara looked at him, and in his eyes she saw not just a man but a warrior, a man who was willing to risk everything to protect his family. And in that moment, she knew that she would stand with him. She was a woman who had been running from her past, but she had found a man who was willing to fight for her future. She was a woman who had been a ghost, and he was a man who had made her real. They were a team, a single, unwavering unit, and they were ready for the final battle. The journey to the Whitlocks' home was a long, silent one. They left Maeve in the care of Jed and his wife, a kind, elderly woman who had grown fond of the little girl. Ilara and Caleb sat in the carriage, the tension between them a palpable thing. This was it, the final stand, the culmination of months of legal battles, of personal attacks, of a love that had been forged in the fire of adversity. The Whitlocks' home was a mansion, a sprawling, opulent structure that was a stark contrast to the humble, functional beauty of the Tanner ranch. As they pulled up, a stern-faced butler met them at the door. "Mr. and Mrs. Tanner," he said, his voice filled with a cold disdain. "Mrs. Whitlock is expecting you. She said to show you to the drawing room." The drawing room was a picture of wealth and extravagance, velvet curtains, polished mahogany, and portraits of the Whitlock family hanging on the walls. Martha Whitlock sat in a high-backed chair, her face a mask of cold fury. Her son, Arthur, was standing nervously behind her, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I must say, Caleb," Martha began, her voice a sharp, cutting blade, "I am surprised to see you here. After all your legal battles, I thought you would have learned your lesson. You are a fool to come to my home." Caleb stepped forward, his body a solid wall, his gaze fixed on her. "I'm not here for a lesson, Martha. I'm here for a resolution. The harassment ends now. The threats end now. The lies end now." Martha laughed, a brittle, mocking sound. "And what makes you think you have the power to stop me, Caleb? You're a man with a broken leg and you've brought a woman who is a fraud." Elara stepped forward, her chin held high. "I am not a fraud, Mrs. Whitlock. My name is Elara Tanner. I am a woman who came here with nothing and who has found everything. I have found a man who loves me. I have found a daughter who loves me. I have found a home, and I will not let you take it away from me." Martha's eyes narrowed. "You're a liar. You married him for money. Your past is a testament to that. You are a woman who runs from her problems." "Yes," Elara said, her voice filled with a quiet, terrifying sincerity. "I was. But I am not anymore. I am here to face you. I am here to face my past, and I am here to tell you that you are a criminal. You are not a woman fighting for her family. You are a woman fighting for greed, and we have the proof." Caleb pulled a folder from his satchel. It was filled with the documents Thorne had given them. The contracts, the payoffs, the false medical reports. He placed it on the table, a solid, undeniable weight. "This is the evidence, Martha," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Proof of your campaign to destroy me. Proof of your bribery. Proof of your conspiracy. If you continue to harass us, we will go to the authorities. We will expose you. We will ruin your family name. We will destroy your legacy." Martha looked at the folder, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew her family name was her only currency. She had built her life on a foundation of respectability and power. To have it all exposed would be a humiliation far worse than any court ruling. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Caleb said, his voice filled with a quiet, powerful conviction. "I have nothing to lose. I have a family now. I have a purpose. You have everything to lose. Your reputation, your legacy, your life." Martha looked at him, and for the first time, she saw a man who was not a victim, but a victor. She saw a man who was not just a father, but a husband, a protector, a warrior. She looked at Elara, and she saw not a scared widow, but a woman who was a force of nature. She saw a love that was stronger than any amount of money, a bond that was more powerful than any legal document. She finally broke. The cold mask of fury melted away, revealing a woman who was old, tired and defeated. "Get out," she whispered, her voice a low, painful sob. "Get out of my house." Caleb took Elara's hand, and they walked out of the mansion, a sense of profound relief washing over them. The battle was over. The war was won. They had faced the darkness, and they had won. They had done it together. The journey back to the ranch was filled with a triumphant silence. The weight of the world, the constant threat of the Whitlocks, had been lifted. The air smelled of clean, fresh hope. As they drove, Elara looked at Caleb, a smile on her face. He was her hero, her partner, her love. He was the man who had given her a reason to live, a reason to fight. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "It's over. It's over," he agreed, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers lacing with hers. "And we can finally start our life, our real life." He pulled the wagon up to the house, and Maeve was waiting for them on the porch, her small face filled with a radiant joy. She ran to them, her little body a blur of motion. She threw her arms around Caleb, then around Elara, a silent, joyful hug that was more powerful than any word. That evening, a sense of peace settled over the ranch. The house was no longer a place of ghosts, but a home filled with love, laughter, and a sense of belonging. As the sun set, Elara and Caleb sat on the porch, their hands clasped. "I want to do it right, Elara," Caleb said, his voice low. "I want to marry you. Not as a business deal, not for a contract, but for real. With a preacher and a church and a celebration. I want to tell the whole world that you are my wife, my love, my partner." Elara's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Caleb," she whispered, her voice filled with a profound joy. yes. The wedding was a simple affair, but it was filled with more love and happiness than any opulent ceremony. The small town of Harmony, which had once been filled with whispers and gossip about them, now came out in full force to support them. Jed was Caleb's best man, his face filled with a quiet pride. Maeve, in a simple white dress, was the flower girl, her voice a clear, beautiful song as she sang a hymn. Ilara walked down the aisle, her heart a symphony of emotions. She was a woman who had been running from her past, a woman who had been alone in the world, but now she was a woman who was loved, a woman who had a family, a woman who was home. As she stood before the preacher, her hand in Caleb's, she looked at him, and in his eyes she saw not just a man, but a promise of a life filled with love, a promise of a future filled with joy, a promise of a second chance. The preacher's words were a blur, but she heard the ones that mattered most, the ones that made her Ilara Tanner, the ones that made her his wife. The kiss they shared was not just a kiss of a husband and wife, it was a kiss of two people who had found each other in the darkness, who had held on to each other, and who had emerged into the light. It was a kiss that sealed their new life, their new family, their new love. It was a kiss that promised a future that was not just about surviving, but about thriving. 5 years passed, and the Tanner Ranch was a testament to the power of love and perseverance. The fields were green and lush, the cattle herd was thriving, and the house was a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the scent of freshly baked bread. Maeve was no longer a silent child. She was a bright, talkative, and happy little girl, her voice a constant, joyful presence in their lives. She was a horsewoman now, riding her own pony, her laughter echoing through the canyons. Her bond with Ilara was unbreakable, a mother-daughter relationship forged in love and understanding. Her love for Caleb was a deep, quiet thing, a silent reverence for the man who was not only her father, but also her hero. And Caleb and Ilara's love, which had been born of a desperate deal, had deepened and grown, a love that was stronger and more profound with each passing day. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his hand instinctively reached for hers, the way he would kiss her forehead and whisper good night. It was a love that was quiet, but it was a love that was true. One afternoon, Ilara was in the garden, a small baby bump showing beneath her apron. She was humming a soft, tuneless song as she tended to the flowers. Maeve, now 12, came and sat beside her, her gaze fixed on the field of golden wildflowers that Ilara had planted. "Mama," Maeve said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "They're so beautiful." "They are, sweetie," Ilara said, her hand resting on her stomach. "They're a promise that something beautiful can grow even in the hardest of places." Maeve looked at her, her eyes filled with a new, profound understanding. "Like us?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. Ilara smiled, her eyes welling up with tears. "Yes, sweetie, like us." Just then, Caleb appeared. He walked to them, his crutch now a distant memory, his gait confident and strong. He sat on the ground, his arms wrapped around Ilara, his head resting on her shoulder. He kissed her hair, then kissed Maeve's cheek. He looked at Ilara, a profound love in his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper, "when I first met you, I thought I was hiring a woman for a job. I thought I was just getting a wife for a year. I thought I was just doing what I had to do to protect Maeve." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "I was a fool. I was so busy fighting a legal battle that I forgot about the real fight. The fight for happiness. The fight for a family. You gave me that, Ilara. You gave me a second chance, and you gave Maeve a voice." Ilara's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me a second chance too, Caleb," she whispered, her voice filled with a raw, undeniable sincerity. "You gave me a home. You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to live." Maeve, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. She looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with a deep, profound love. She reached out and took Ilara's hand, her small fingers intertwining with her mother's. "Don't leave us, Mama," she said, her voice a clear, beautiful song. "Ever." Ilara's heart soared. It was the title of their story. The words that had once been a desperate plea were now a joyful truth. She was not a woman on the run anymore. She was a woman who was home. She was not a woman with nothing. She was a woman with a family. She was not a woman who was a fraud. She was a woman who was loved. She had found her purpose, her home, her love. She had found her forever. And in the heart of a ranch in the middle of nowhere, she knew that she would never, ever leave.